Have you ever seen the movie The Mummy, where an adventurer and a bunch of archaeologists found an excavation site at an ancient city in Egypt and accidentally woken up an evil mummy in the process? You probably have. Have you ever wondered what archaeologists does at an excavation site or what they do with those broken pieces of treasure they have found? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have come to the right video. My name is Nadia Capella, an English student from Bunda Mulia University, and today we're going to uncover what archaeologists does with their discovery. When an archaeologist found pieces of broken objects at an excavation site, like pottery for example, they usually envision how that pieces of broken pottery were made, what kind of materials it was made of, and what they were used for. The archaeologists also determine the age of the pottery, how it changed over time, and its popularity by looking at its frequency of style and the occurrences of finding that pottery at the excavation site. Since archaeologists need evidence to determine the date and function of the pottery, they need to study the pottery itself to figure out its origin, materials, and its distributor. This evidence is called distributional evidence. They could also decipher what the pottery was intended for, whether it was served as a vessel for food and wine, as traded objects, or given as gifts in the past. Other evidence they could find by studying the pottery is what is called evidence of function. By figuring this out, the archaeologists could find out what the excavation site was used for and the group of people who used to live there. This evidence, however, is a bit difficult to interpret because of several reasons. One of which is the pottery usually not found in places where it was being used. Another reason why evidence of function is difficult to identify is because how the objects were discovered. Archaeologists usually found a bunch of objects in one spot, but even if the objects look similar to one another, they cannot assume they have the same function. That is why they need to study the objects one by one and identify its function separately. To make their job easier, they study the pottery by its form. The form of the objects can give them a rough idea of its function and the sustainability in serving said function. However, they need to be careful because there is an imposter among the objects. This imposter is called skeuomorphs. Skeuomorphs are identical copies of the objects but are made with different materials. One example comes from the 15th century Dutch ceramics. A bronze cauldron was copied with a ceramic, down to the details to its big angled handles. However, the copycat couldn't function as it was intended for, since the ceramic handles couldn't support the weight of the pot and its content. To recap it briefly, after finding their discoveries, archaeologists would study their findings in order to determine its age, origins, materials, functions, and its distributor. By studying the objects, the archaeologists could also find pieces of information about the excavation site where the objects were found. But in the midst of discovering and studying the background of said objects, the archaeologists might come across a skeuomorphs, a copycat of the original objects. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope we can learn something from this. Have a very nice day.